So there I was, standing in the hallway of the Galactic Military Academy, watching my fellow cadets place bets on whether I'd survive the next 30 minutes. Not whether I'd succeed. Mind you, whether I'd survive. Real confidence booster. That. The subject of all this cheerful speculation was the Corvanian escape chamber, a gleaming metal monstrosity that squatted in the center of Training Bay 7 like a chrome tumor. According to Academy legend, no cadet had ever escaped it in under 10 minutes. The current record holder was some hotshot from Rigel Prime who managed it in 8 minutes and 43 seconds, and they still talked about him like he'd invented faster-than-light travel. Commander Vextel stood beside the chamber, all 4 of his arms crossed in what I'd learned was his default expression of smug superiority. He was a Corvanian himself, which explained why he took such personal pride in watching cadets fail at his species' idea of a fun puzzle. His skin had that distinctive blue-gray tint that made him look perpetually annoyed, though in his case, that might just have been his personality. "Cadet Martinez," he announced, somehow managing to make my name sound like a communicable disease. "You have 30 minutes to escape the chamber. This is considered generous, given your species' documented limitations in spatial reasoning and technological adaptation." I nodded politely, while mentally adding him to my growing list of people who'd be eating their words before lunch. The list was getting pretty long these days. The chamber contains 17 distinct puzzle sequences. Vextel continued, warming to his favorite subject. Each must be completed in the correct order to progress to the next section. The AI monitoring system will provide guidance, but only if you demonstrate sufficient cognitive ability to warrant assistance. Behind me, I could hear Zeph, my crystalline classmate, whispering calculations to anyone who'd listen. The probability matrices alone would take a human at least 15 minutes to process, assuming optimal brain function, he was saying. Which is a generous assumption. Grot, who looked like someone had crossed a spider with a pessimistic accountant, clicked his mandibles in agreement. "I give her 12 minutes before she starts crying," he muttered. Even Kira, who was usually nice to me, was shaking her head with all 6 of her tentacles. "Perhaps you should review the technical specifications one more time, Luna," she suggested helpfully. "The quantum lock mechanisms alone require understanding of 7th-dimensional mathematics." I appreciated the concern, really I did. But here's the thing about humans, that the rest of the galaxy never quite seemed to grasp: we don't actually need to understand how something works to break it. "Thanks for the pep talk, everyone," I said, cracking my knuckles in a way that made several aliens step back nervously. "But I think I've got this." Commander Vextel's 4 eyes narrowed. "Very well, Cadet. Your 30 minutes begin when you enter the chamber. Try not to trigger the emergency medical protocols on your way out." The betting pool was up to 50 credits against me by the time I stepped up to the chamber door. I could have been offended, but honestly, 50 credits was pretty good odds. I was almost tempted to bet against myself. Almost. Before I could make my grand entrance into the Chamber of Doom, my classmates decided they needed to share their wisdom. You know, because nothing says team spirit like a bunch of aliens explaining why you're about to fail spectacularly. Zeph floated over first, his crystalline body refracting the overhead lights in a way that probably looked impressive to someone who wasn't about to watch him eat his words. "Luna, perhaps you should consider the mathematical approach," he said, in that tone professors use when explaining why water is wet. "The chamber's quantum encryption follows a base 14 system with logarithmic probability cascades." I nodded sagely. "Right. Quantum stuff. Got it." "No, you don't understand," Zeph continued, his internal light flickering with what I'd learned was his version of anxiety. "Each puzzle layer requires solving differential equations while maintaining consciousness in a fluctuating gravity field. The cognitive load alone could cause permanent neural damage to your primitive brain structure." "My primitive brain structure appreciates the concern," I replied, patting his shoulder in a way that made him ring like a wind chime. Grot scuttled over next, his 8 legs clicking against the metal floor like an impatient typewriter. "I've analyzed the failure data from the last 200 attempts," he announced, because of course he had. 97% of cadets become trapped in the 3rd sequence. The remaining 3% trigger the emergency shutdown protocols and require psychological counseling. "What about the ones who actually escape?" I asked. Grot's mandibles clicked dismissively. "Statistical anomalies. Probably cheated." Kira approached more diplomatically, her tentacles arranged in what I'd learned was her trying to be helpful configuration. "Luna, I've memorized all 17 puzzle sequences," she said earnestly. "The technical specifications alone require fluency in quantum mechanics, subspace engineering, and advanced xenobiology. Perhaps we could study together after your inevitable failure." "That's sweet, Kira, but I'm pretty sure I've got this figured out." Commander Vextal had been listening to this exchange with growing amusement, all four of his arms now crossed so tightly he looked like he was giving himself a hug. Cadet Martinez, he interjected, perhaps you'd like to hear about the chamber's sophisticated AI system before you begin. Sure, why not? He gestured grandly at the chrome monstrosity behind him. The Corvanian escape chamber is monitored by a Class 7 artificial intelligence with processing power equivalent to 3 billion organic brains. It adapts to each user's approach, increasing difficulty parameters to maintain optimal challenge levels. So it cheats. It optimizes, Vextal corrected stiffly. The AI also controls 17 independent security systems, 43 energy barriers, and quantum locks that require simultaneous manipulation of matter at the subatomic level. I looked at the chamber, then back at him. And you guys built this? Why exactly? To test tactical thinking and technological adaptability under pressure, he replied, clearly proud of his species' idea of a good time. Right, and how long did you say the record was? 8 minutes and 43 seconds, set by Cadet Dexnor of Rigel Prime, who went on to become a renowned tactical strategist. Huh. I stretched casually, enjoying the way several aliens flinched when my joints popped. Well, that gives me something to aim for. Zeph's crystalline form practically vibrated with disbelief. Luna, you can't possibly think you can beat a Rigelian's record. Their brain architecture is specifically evolved for complex problem solving. They have 7 distinct processing centers and can calculate probability matrices in real time. Yeah, but do they know how to break stuff? The question hung in the air like a bad smell. My classmates exchanged glances that roughly translated to the human has finally lost it completely. Commander Vextal's expression shifted from smug to mildly concerned. Cadet Martinez, I should remind you that deliberately damaging Academy property results in immediate expulsion and a rather substantial fine. Who said anything about deliberately? I grinned and cracked my knuckles again. Sometimes things just break when humans are around. We're like that. The betting pool had reached 75 credits against me by the time I finished stretching. I was starting to feel a little insulted by the lack of faith, but then again they were about to learn why humans had a reputation for being unpredictable. Or as we preferred to call it, creative. The chamber door hissed open with the kind of dramatic flourish that screamed expensive and unnecessarily complicated. I stepped inside and immediately understood why this thing had such a reputation. The interior looked like someone had taken a spaceship's bridge, a mad scientist laboratory, and a disco ball, then thrown them all into a blender set to intimidate. Holographic displays flickered to life around me, showing what looked like star charts mixed with mathematical equations that would have made Einstein weep. Energy barriers hummed ominously in shades of blue and purple that definitely weren't natural. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there were blinking lights, floating symbols and mechanical components that moved for no apparent reason other than to look menacing. The AI's voice filled the chamber with the kind of smooth, condescending tone that made you want to punch something electronic. Welcome, Cadet Martinez. I am the Chamber Intelligence, designation CI-7 Alpha. I will be monitoring your progress and providing guidance as needed. Great. Love a backseat driver. Before we begin, please note that this chamber is equipped with 43 distinct security systems, 17 puzzle sequences, and quantum-locked barriers that require precise manipulation of subatomic particles. Do you require a preliminary explanation of the fundamental physics involved? I was already walking toward the first section, which featured a floating array of geometric shapes that were rotating, pulsing, and generally doing their best impression of a migraine. Nah, I'm good. Very well. Your 30-minute timer begins now. The first sequence requires you to arrange the holographic matrices in accordance with the Corvanian prime theorem, while maintaining stable energy flow through the quantum resonance channels. The shapes were pretty, I'll give them that. They floated in perfect formation, each one glowing with its own internal light and spinning at precisely calculated intervals. According to the holographic display helpfully appearing in front of me, I was supposed to solve for x in an equation that looked like it had been written by someone having a stroke. From outside the chamber, I could hear Zeph providing commentary. The opening sequence alone typically takes 4 to 6 minutes. Cadet Martinez will need to calculate the harmonic frequencies while accounting for quantum fluctuation variables. I walked up to the nearest floating shape, which looked sort of like a cube that had been turned inside out and then argued with by a mathematician. Instead of studying the equation, I reached out and poked it. The shape immediately stopped spinning and made a noise like a confused computer. Cadet Martinez, the AI said, and I could swear it sounded slightly strained, that is not the intended solution method. But did it work? There was a pause. The sequence parameters have been altered. The other shapes were still spinning, but now they were doing it in a noticeably less confident way. I poked the next one. It also stopped and beeped unhappily. The third one I actually picked up, which made the AI emit what sounded suspiciously like a digital sigh. "This is highly irregular," it announced. "Yeah, I get that a lot." Outside I could hear Grot's mandibles clicking rapidly. "What is she doing?" "The resonance patterns are completely destabilized." I had managed to collect 3 of the floating shapes, and was now juggling them while the remaining ones spun around me like confused fireflies. The holographic equation was flashing red and making distressed beeping sounds. "Perhaps," the AI suggested with the kind of patience usually reserved for small children and the mentally unstable, "you would prefer to approach this puzzle using traditional mathematical analysis." Traditional's overrated. I caught all 3 shapes in one hand, and looked around for somewhere to put them. There was a pedestal in the corner that looked promising, so I strolled over and deposited them there. Immediately, every light in the chamber turned green, and a section of the wall slid away to reveal the next area. The silence from outside the chamber was deafening. "Well," the AI said finally, "that was efficient. Thanks. What's next?" The second section looked even more complicated than the first. Energy barriers crisscrossed the space like a laser light show, and I could see more floating puzzles beyond them. According to the helpful display that popped up, I was supposed to modulate my biosignature to match specific frequency patterns that would allow me to pass through the barriers without being disintegrated. "The energy barriers are calibrated to prevent unauthorized passage," the AI explained. "You must synchronize your biological quantum signature with the barrier frequencies using the meditation alcove and consciousness expansion protocols." I looked at the meditation alcove, which was basically a fancy chair surrounded by more blinking lights. Then I looked at the energy barriers, which were humming along about 3 feet off the ground. "Or," I said, dropping to my hands and knees, "I could just crawl under them." The barriers, it turned out, didn't extend all the way to the floor. "That is not," the AI began. "Not what?" I called out, already halfway across the room. "Not creative problem solving." From outside, I could hear Commander Vextel's voice rising in what might have been panic. "The energy barriers have proximity sensors. They should have detected her approach. Apparently they weren't calibrated for humans crawling around like maintenance workers." Kira observed. I popped up on the other side of the barriers and dusted off my knees. "What's the third puzzle?" The AI was quiet for a long moment. "Processing," it finally said. "Take your time. I'll just be over here not following the rules." 2 minutes and 37 seconds had elapsed on the timer. I was making good time, and I hadn't even started getting creative yet. The third puzzle looked like someone had taken a perfectly good room and decided it needed more floating death traps. Mechanical arms sprouted from the walls at random intervals, each one holding what appeared to be a different torture device disguised as a precision instrument. Energy conduits snaked across the ceiling, crackling with enough electricity to power a small city, and in the center of it all sat a console that looked like it had been designed by a committee of sadistic engineers. The third sequence requires precise manipulation of quantum field generators, while avoiding the automated defense systems, the AI announced, though it sounded less confident than before. "You must calculate the optimal path through the kinetic barriers, while simultaneously solving for the harmonic resonance frequencies of the energy matrix." I studied the mechanical arms, which were waving around like angry robot octopi. Each one moved in a predictable pattern, sweeping across specific areas of the room in timed intervals. The console in the center had about 30 different buttons, switches and dials, all of them blinking in what was probably a very meaningful sequence if you happened to be a Corvanian engineer. "The defense systems are programmed to respond to aggressive movement," the AI continued helpfully. "Sudden motions will trigger immediate countermeasures." "Define sudden," I said, already walking toward the nearest mechanical arm. "Cadet Martinez, I strongly advise against." I grabbed the mechanical arm as it swung past and used it like a subway handle, letting it carry me across half the room before dropping off next to the console. The arm continued its sweep, apparently too confused to register what had just happened. "That was unexpected," the AI admitted. "Humans are like that." I examined the console, which was covered in symbols that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a serious grudge against the concept of simplicity. "So what's this thing supposed to do?" "The console controls the quantum field generators. You must input the correct sequence to stabilize the energy matrix and unlock the next chamber." I looked at the 30 buttons, then at the helpful holographic display showing what appeared to be a mathematical equation written in ancient Corvanian. The symbols were doing that thing where they looked almost familiar but were actually completely incomprehensible, like trying to read a menu in a language that used math instead of words. "And the correct sequence would be." "That is for you to determine through careful analysis of the quantum field fluctuations and their harmonic relationships." From outside the chamber, I could hear Zeph's increasingly frantic calculations. The quantum resonance patterns require simultaneous processing of 17 variables. Even if she could read ancient Corvanian, the mathematical complexity alone would take at least 6 minutes. I spotted something interesting. Underneath all the fancy alien buttons was a small panel marked with a symbol that looked suspiciously like a power indicator. It was the only thing on the console that wasn't blinking, pulsing, or generally trying to give me a seizure. "Hey AI buddy," I called out. "What happens if I just turn this thing off and back on again?" "That is absolutely not." I flipped the power switch. Every light in the room went out. The mechanical arms stopped mid-swing. The energy conduits stopped crackling. For about 5 seconds the chamber was completely silent except for the sound of my own breathing and what might have been the AI having a digital aneurysm. Then everything came back online, but now all the lights were green instead of red, and the mechanical arms were retracting into the walls. "Did that work?" I asked. Another long pause. "The system has reset to default parameters. The chamber is now in maintenance mode." "Cool. Does that mean I can go to the next section?" "Technically, yes." A new doorway opened with the kind of reluctant mechanical grinding that suggested the chamber itself was having second thoughts about this whole situation. Outside, the betting pool had apparently reached critical mass. I could hear coins and credit chips hitting the floor as aliens started having what sounded like nervous breakdowns in 17 different languages. "She turned it off," Grot was saying in the tone of someone announcing the end of the world. "She just turned it off." "That's not even a solution," Zeph protested. "That's just random button pressing." "Percussive maintenance," I called out cheerfully as I headed for the next section. "It's a human specialty." The fourth puzzle was some kind of gravity maze where the floor, walls, and ceiling kept switching places while holographic obstacles tried to knock you into what looked like a pit of very unfriendly energy. The AI explained something about spatial orientation and three-dimensional thinking, but I was already studying the room's architecture. The thing about artificial gravity is that it needs generators, and generators need power conduits. And power conduits, if you know what to look for, are usually hidden behind access panels that are designed to be open for maintenance. Cadet Martinez, this puzzle requires you to navigate the shifting gravitational fields while maintaining spatial awareness in 3 dimensions. The holographic obstacles are programmed to respond to your movement patterns, and I had found the access panel and was already unscrewing it with a coin from my pocket. Inside was exactly what I expected: a bunch of wires, some kind of processing unit, and a manual override switch labeled emergency shutdown in nice simple galactic standard. "What are you doing?" the AI asked, and now it definitely sounded worried. "Emergency maintenance," I replied, flipping the switch. The gravity maze stopped mazing. Everything settled to normal orientation with a series of mechanical clicks, and the holographic obstacles flickered out of existence. The gravitational field generators are not supposed to be manually overridden during testing scenarios. Yeah, but they can be, which is really all that matters. I walked across the now stable floor and waved at the next doorway, which opened with what sounded like a defeated sigh. The fifth puzzle involved some kind of quantum lock that required precise manipulation of subatomic particles through focused mental energy. It looked like a big fancy safe with more dials than a radio station and enough security warnings to stock a small library. I knocked on it. It made a hollow metal sound. "That's not how quantum locks work," the AI said weakly. "How do they work?" "The quantum encryption requires you to visualize specific particle interactions while maintaining harmonic resonance with the lock's consciousness interface." "The lock has consciousness. It's a metaphor, right?" I knocked on it again, harder this time. Something rattled inside. "Hey, I think something's loose in here. Please do not apply percussive force to the quantum encryption matrix." I gave it a solid thump with my fist. Something inside went click, and the entire front panel swung open like a door. "How did the AI begin?" "Sometimes if you hit things just right, they stop being broken." I peered inside the now open lock. Also, this thing wasn't actually locked. The mechanism was just stuck. That is impossible. The quantum encryption is specifically designed to prevent people from checking if it's actually locked, apparently. The timer read 1 minute and 53 seconds. I was now officially ahead of schedule, and starting to feel a little bad for whoever had programmed this thing. Behind me I could hear the sound of aliens having what appeared to be collective nervous breakdowns. "She's not solving the puzzles," Commander Vextel was saying in a voice that suggested his worldview was undergoing rapid and unwelcome revision. "She's just ignoring them." The human appears to be treating sophisticated technology as if it were malfunctioning equipment, Kira observed with the kind of scientific fascination usually reserved for watching train wrecks. Because that's what it is, I called out. Overcomplicated, expensive, and probably needs a good maintenance check. The sixth puzzle was some kind of holographic maze where the walls kept shifting, and the floor was covered in pressure plates that triggered various unpleasant-looking energy beams. The AI didn't even bother explaining this one. It just made a sound like a computer sighing and opened all the doors at once. Are we having a breakdown? I asked. I am experiencing cognitive dissonance, the AI admitted. My programming did not account for solutions based on identifying design flaws rather than engaging with puzzle mechanics. Yeah, that's the thing about humans. We don't really do things the way they're supposed to be done. I am beginning to understand this. The 7th through 16th puzzles fell in rapid succession. I unplugged things, flipped switches, knocked on walls that turned out to be holographic, and generally treated the entire chamber like a piece of equipment that needed troubleshooting, rather than a sophisticated test of intelligence. By the time I reached the final chamber, the timer read 1 minute and 58 seconds, and I was pretty sure the AI was having what could charitably be called an existential crisis. The final puzzle, it said in the tone of someone announcing their own funeral, requires you to synthesize all previous knowledge into a comprehensive solution that demonstrates mastery of quantum mechanics, spatial reasoning, and technological integration. I looked around the final chamber. It was basically a big room with a fancy door on the far side, and a lot of impressive-looking equipment that was probably designed to make the whole thing seem more complicated than it actually was. Or I said, studying the door, I could just figure out how to open that door. That door is secured with 17 different locking mechanisms, each requiring a separate solution key derived from the previous puzzle sequences. Right. I walked over to examine the door more closely. It was impressive, I'll give it that. Lots of glowing bits and mechanical components that moved in precise, intimidating patterns. But here's the thing about doors. I grabbed the handle and pulled. It was unlocked. The door mechanisms are supposed to engage automatically when the AI began. When what? When someone doesn't just check if it's open first. 2 minutes and 4 seconds. I had beaten the previous record by more than 6.5 minutes, and I was pretty sure I'd given an AI a nervous breakdown in the process. But I wasn't done yet. The door stood there looking smug and secure, covered in enough blinking lights and mechanical gewgaws to make a Christmas tree jealous. I had my hand on the handle, ready to complete what was shaping up to be the most anticlimactic escape in Academy history, when something made me pause. Call it intuition. Call it paranoia. Call it the result of growing up in a species that survived by being suspicious of things that seemed too easy. But something about this door felt wrong. AI, I said, not moving my hand from the handle. This door is unlocked, right? The door will open when the proper exit sequence has been completed, the AI replied, and there was something in its digital tone that sounded almost relieved, like it was finally back on familiar ground. That's not what I asked. I asked if it's unlocked. A pause. The door's locking mechanisms are currently inactive. Because I solved all the puzzles? Another pause. Longer this time. Because the chamber's security protocols have been compromised by your unconventional methods. I felt a grin spreading across my face. So this is a trap. The chamber is designed to test cadets' ability to recognize when apparent victory is actually a final challenge. And if I open this door, the exit sequence will activate additional security measures designed to test your ability to handle unexpected complications. From outside, I could hear the aliens placing what sounded like frantic new bets. Apparently word had gotten out that I was about to either set a new record or trigger whatever nasty surprise the Corvanians had built into their fancy death trap. What kind of additional security measures? I asked. I am not programmed to provide that information. Right. I studied the door more carefully. It was definitely the real exit. I could see the corridor beyond through the small window at the top. But the frame around it was reinforced with enough metal to stop a small asteroid, and there were energy conduits running along the edges that were practically humming with contained power. The thing about traps is that they only work if you do what they expect you to do, and the Corvanians, bless their four-armed hearts, expected everyone to either solve their puzzles the hard way or open the door and face whatever nasty surprise they'd programmed. They probably hadn't considered the possibility that someone might just ignore the door entirely. I walked over to the wall next to the door and knocked on it experimentally. It made a different sound than the door. More hollow, less reinforced. I knocked in a few different spots, listening to the way the sound changed. Cadet Martinez, the AI said, and now it definitely sounded nervous. What are you doing? Checking the construction quality. The walls are reinforced with quantum-stabilized titanium alloy. They are designed to withstand direct hits from military-grade plasma cannons. That's nice. I found a spot where the wall sounded particularly hollow and gave it a solid punch. The metal dented inward with a satisfying crunch. But did you guys reinforce the internal supports? The internal supports are constructed to galactic military specifications for. I hit the wall again harder this time. The dent got bigger, and I could hear something creaking behind the metal plating. Oh, this is not good. Grott's voice drifted in from outside. She's not going to open the door. She's going to go through the wall. That's impossible, Zeph protested. The structural integrity calculations alone. I hit the wall a third time, and something inside definitely gave way. A hairline crack appeared along the edge of the metal panel, and I could feel air moving through it. The walls are not designed to be exit points, the AI announced, and it was starting to sound distinctly panicked. Please use the designated door. Yeah, but here's the thing about walls, I said, stepping back to get a better angle for my next punch. They're only as strong as the guy who built them, and that guy was probably thinking about plasma cannons, not someone punching them from the inside. I took a deep breath, planted my feet, and put everything I had into the next hit. The metal panel buckled inward with a screech of tortured alloy, and suddenly I was looking at a gap big enough to stick my arm through. This is highly irregular, the AI protested. So I keep hearing. I grabbed the edges of the hole and started pulling. The metal was tough, but it had been designed to resist force from the outside, not someone tearing it apart from the inside. Each piece I pulled away made the next piece easier to remove. From outside, I could hear what sounded like every alarm in the academy going off at once. Klaxons wailed, lights flashed, and over it all, Commander Vextal's voice rose in what might have been the Corvanian equivalent of profanity. She's dismantling the chamber, he was shouting. The structural integrity is compromised. The quantum containment fields are destabilizing. Should we stop her? Kira asked. With what? Grott replied. She's inside a reinforced chamber that's designed to be inescapable. I had managed to tear a hole big enough to crawl through, but crawling seemed undignified after coming this far. Instead, I braced my feet against the door behind me, and pushed against the edges of the hole with both hands. The metal groaned, protested, and then gave way all at once. The entire section of wall came away in my hands like I was peeling open a very expensive, very complicated tin can. Alarms were going off everywhere now. Emergency lighting bathed the training bay in angry red strobes, and I could see maintenance crews running around outside looking like they were trying to decide between putting out a fire and calling for backup. The chamber's quantum containment matrix is failing, the AI announced, and it sounded genuinely distressed now. Structural collapse is imminent. Emergency evacuation protocols are now in effect. Relax, I called out, stepping through my improvised exit while carefully avoiding the jagged edges. It's just a hole in the wall. The rest of your fancy chamber is fine. I emerged into the training bay covered in metal dust and small pieces of what had probably been very expensive quantum-stabilized titanium alloy. The timer on the wall read 2 minutes and 11 seconds. The silence that greeted me was the kind of absolute quiet that usually preceded either spontaneous applause or someone calling security. Commander Vextal stood frozen in the middle of the room, all 4 of his arms hanging at his sides, staring at the gaping hole in his species' pride and joy, like he was watching his own funeral. Around him my classmates had arranged themselves in a rough semicircle, and every single one of them was looking at me like I'd just violated several laws of physics. Which, to be fair, I probably had. So I said, brushing metal dust off my uniform, "Do I pass?" The betting pool had apparently reached the point where aliens were just throwing money in the air and walking away. Credit chips rained down around us like very expensive confetti, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear what sounded like maintenance crews arguing about who was going to explain this to the Academy administration. Commander Vextal's 4 eyes were still fixed on the hole in his chamber. When he finally spoke, his voice had the hollow quality of someone whose worldview had just been forcibly restructured. The chamber, he said slowly, is designed to be escape-proof. Yeah, I got that impression. The walls are reinforced with quantum-stabilized titanium. They were pretty tough, I admitted. The structural integrity is maintained by 17 independent support systems. Good thing I only broke 1 wall then. He turned to look at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, Commander Vextal looked genuinely confused. How did you know the internal supports weren't reinforced? I shrugged. I didn't. But walls are walls, and if you hit them hard enough in the right spot they break. It's kind of a universal constant. That is not how engineering works. Maybe not Corvanian engineering. But it's definitely how human engineering works. Behind him, the chamber's AI was apparently having some kind of breakdown. I could hear it muttering to itself about unprecedented structural failure, and recalibrating probability matrices, and requesting immediate consultation with facilities management. "The maintenance crew is going to hate you," Kira observed, though she sounded more impressed than horrified. "Yeah, probably." I looked back at the hole in the wall, which was still smoking slightly around the edges. But hey, I beat the record. The next few minutes were what you might charitably call organized chaos, or what you might more accurately call a bureaucratic meltdown of epic proportions. First came the maintenance crews, who took one look at the gaping hole in the chamber wall, and immediately started arguing about whether this fell under routine maintenance, structural damage, or active Deathworlder. The head of facilities, a long-suffering Centaurian named Chief Yex, arrived with a clipboard and the expression of someone who'd just been told they'd have to explain this to accounting. "Cadet Martinez," he said wearily, "do you have any idea how much quantum-stabilized titanium costs per square meter? More than I make in a year. More than you'll make in several years. Assuming you live long enough to graduate, which is looking increasingly unlikely given your apparent hobby of destroying Academy property." Commander Vextal was still standing in the same spot, occasionally glancing between me and the hole like he was trying to solve a particularly complicated math problem. His forearms had started moving in small, agitated circles, which I'd learned was the Corvanian equivalent of nervous pacing. "This is unprecedented," he kept muttering. The structural integrity calculations were verified by 17 different engineering departments. The reinforcement matrices were tested against military-grade weapons. The quantum stabilization fields were probably overkill for keeping cadets inside a room, I interrupted gently. That room was designed to contain a small explosion. Good thing I didn't explode then. The Academy's medical team arrived next, apparently under the impression that anyone who'd just punched through a military-grade wall must be suffering from some kind of traumatic injury. When they discovered that I was completely unharmed, except for some scraped knuckles and a uniform full of metal dust, they started taking measurements and running scans like I was some kind of exotic specimen. "Bone density is within normal human parameters," the chief medic announced, sounding disappointed. "Muscle mass shows no signs of enhancement. Neural activity is completely normal." "How is this possible? Humans are like that," I said for what felt like the 100th time that day. Zeph had been running calculations on his internal processors for the past 10 minutes, and the results were apparently giving him a headache. His crystalline form was flickering erratically, which was either the result of severe cognitive strain or the alien equivalent of a nervous breakdown. The force required to breach quantum-stabilized titanium should have been approximately 47,000 pounds per square inch, he announced. To anyone who would listen. Human muscular structure is not capable of generating forces of that magnitude. The physics don't work. The math doesn't work. Nothing works. "Maybe your math is wrong," I suggested. Zeph's internal light flared bright enough to make everyone squint. "My math is never wrong. I am a third-generation quantum processor with dedicated calculation matrices and 17 backup verification systems. And yet here we are, standing next to a hole in a wall that your math says shouldn't exist." Grot, meanwhile, had produced what looked like a handheld computer, and was frantically updating what I assumed were his betting algorithms. His 8 legs were clicking against the floor in a pattern that suggested either extreme agitation or the alien equivalent of maniacal laughter. "The probability calculations were completely wrong," he was muttering. "Completely wrong. The failure rate assumptions were based on cadets attempting to solve the puzzles, not on cadets completely ignoring the basic premise of puzzle solving itself." "So what you're saying is," I said, "your statistical models didn't account for humans being weird. Weird doesn't begin to cover it. You've just invalidated approximately 3 centuries of Corvanian engineering principles." Kira had been quietly examining the hole in the wall with all 6 of her tentacles, poking at the twisted metal with the kind of scientific curiosity that usually preceded either a breakthrough or a disaster. When she finally spoke, her voice had the thoughtful tone of someone who'd just realized something important. "Luna," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When you were punching through the wall, what exactly were you thinking about?" I considered the question. "Mostly I was thinking about how the metal was bending and where the weak spots were. And also about how this whole thing was way more complicated than it needed to be. You weren't calculating force vectors or structural stress points. I was hitting a wall until it broke. Not really a lot of calculation involved." Kira's tentacles writhed in what I'd learned was her version of deep thought. "That's what I was afraid of. You just did it, without overthinking it." "Yeah, pretty much. We've been approaching this all wrong," she continued. More to herself than to me. We've been treating these challenges like intellectual puzzles that require sophisticated analysis and careful planning. But humans don't think like that, do they? Not really. We mostly just figure out what needs to happen and then make it happen. Even if it means breaking things. Especially if it means breaking things. Commander Vextal had apparently been listening to this conversation because he suddenly straightened up and fixed me with all four of his eyes in a way that suggested he was about to say something important. Cadet Martinez, he said formally. I need to ask you an official question. Shoot. Did you at any point during the escape sequence actually attempt to solve any of the puzzles as they were designed to be solved? I thought about it. Not really. I mean, I looked at them, but mostly I was just trying to figure out how to get past them without doing all the complicated stuff. And you succeeded by treating sophisticated technological systems as if they were, what exactly? Broken equipment that needed fixing, or in the case of the wall, solid obstacles that needed removing. Vextal was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a strange quality to it, like he was announcing something he didn't quite believe himself. Cadet Martinez, you have achieved the fastest escape time in the history of the Corvanian escape chamber. You have also caused the most property damage in the history of the Corvanian escape chamber. You have forced us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about problem solving, engineering design, and the basic principles of logical thinking. Is that good or bad? I honestly don't know anymore. He looked back at the hole in the wall, then at me, then at the hole again. What I do know is that you've just proven that 3 centuries of Corvanian tactical doctrine might be based on the assumption that everyone thinks like a Corvanian. And that's a problem. It is if we ever have to fight humans. Chief Yex looked up from his clipboard with the expression of someone who just realized they had a much bigger problem than property damage. Commander, are you suggesting that human military tactics might be similarly unconventional? I'm suggesting, Vextal said slowly, that if humans approach warfare the way Cadet Martinez approaches escape rooms, then every tactical manual in the galaxy might need to be rewritten. The implications of this statement seemed to sink in gradually. Zeph's flickering intensified. Grott's clicking accelerated to the point where it sounded like machine gun fire. Kira's tentacles started moving in patterns that probably meant something in her native language but looked like panic to me. So I said, trying to lighten the mood, does this mean I pass the course? Commander Vextal looked at me for a long moment, then at the hole in the wall, then back at me. Cadet Martinez, he said finally. You have fundamentally altered my understanding of tactical thinking. You have destroyed expensive academy property. You have caused what I can only describe as an existential crisis among the faculty. And you have done all of this in just over 2 minutes. That's still not an answer to my question. You pass. With honors. And with a very large bill for structural repairs. The maintenance crews were still arguing about the hole, but now their discussion had shifted from how do we fix this, to how do we prevent this from happening again. Chief Yex was making notes that looked suspiciously like security recommendations, and the medical team had started a betting pool on whether human bone density was somehow variable depending on circumstances. As for the betting pool about my escape attempt, well, let's just say that Grott was going to be eating well for the next few months. Apparently being the only one to bet on complete structural failure had made him very popular with the Academy's bookmakers. The AI meanwhile had apparently recovered from its breakdown and was now broadcasting a continuous stream of maintenance requests, security recommendations, and what sounded like philosophical questions about the nature of problem solving. I am updating my behavioral prediction algorithms, it announced to anyone within range. Previous models assumed rational actors operating within established logical frameworks. New models must account for the possibility of completely irrational actors achieving optimal outcomes through methods that violate basic principles of cause and effect. That's a little harsh, I protested. I was being perfectly rational. You punched through a wall instead of opening a door. The door was a trap, the wall wasn't. That is, the AI paused for a long moment. That is actually a valid tactical assessment. I am experiencing cognitive dissonance. Welcome to dealing with humans, Commander Vextal said wearily. I recommend updating your philosophical subroutines while you're at it. As the crowd began to disperse and the maintenance crews started measuring the hole for repairs, I found myself standing alone in front of what had been the most feared training device in the academy. The Corvanian escape chamber, terror of generations of cadets, now had a Luna Martinez-shaped hole in its side, and a deeply confused AI. Not bad for a day's work. Kira approached as I was brushing the last of the metal dust off my uniform. Luna, she said, can I ask you one more question? Sure, what are you planning to do for your final tactical assessment? I looked at the hole in the wall, then at the chamber's blinking lights, then at the maintenance crews who were still arguing about repair costs. I was thinking about taking the advanced strategic planning course, I said. You know, the one where you have to design a battle plan for defending a space station. Kira's tentacles went very still. And you would approach that how exactly? I grinned. Well, first I'd probably look at the space station's structural blueprints. You know, just to see if there are any weak points that might need reinforcing. Oh no. And then I'd want to test the defensive systems, make sure they're working properly. Sometimes these things have bugs, you know? Oh no. It's going to be great. I bet I can find all sorts of ways to improve the design. Kira backed away slowly, her tentacles waving in what was definitely the alien equivalent of panic. I need to speak with the Academy administration. Immediately. As she hurried off, I took one last look at my handiwork. The hole in the wall was already becoming legendary, I could tell. Cadets were taking pictures, instructors were making measurements, and somewhere in the Academy's vast bureaucratic machinery, people were probably writing new rules with titles like Prohibition of Percussive Problem Solving and Human-Specific Structural Reinforcement Requirements. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today I had set a new record, learned that alien overengineering was just as breakable as human overengineering, and given an AI an existential crisis, all in a day's work for a Deathworlder cadet, who'd figured out that sometimes the best way to solve a puzzle is to ignore it completely and punch through the wall instead. After all, humans had been doing that sort of thing for millennia. We just usually called it innovation.